Hello everyone and welcome! In this video I'm going to show you how to paint a kite using watercolors. This is a very simple painting, perfect for beginners. These are the main products I will be using: watercolor paints, brushes, watercolor cardstock, clean water and paper towel. I will be sketching, so I have a pencil and a sketchbook. Printer paper works as well. I also will be using a masking fluid, but this is completely optional, you can work around it. And since I'm making a card, I have a card base. You will find a list of the supplies over on my blog, but you can use whatever supplies you already have or can afford. I first sketched the kite in my sketchbook. You can use a printer paper for that. You could also draw directly onto the watercolor paper, but I like to use a separate paper so I can get the correct shape and size, and I can erase and redraw as much as I need without worrying about damaging the paper. To draw the kite, I started with 2 lines forming a cross, and then I drew 4 lines connecting the cross on each side. Those lines can be either straight or curved. From the bottom of the kite, I drew a wavy line to represent the string that is connected to the kite, and lastly I drew a few bows along the string. The bows I drew in a shape of the number 8, or rather the infinity symbol, but I made the size of each bow more flat. As I was drawing, I made a few adjustments, then I added more bows along the strings, and the sketch is done. I'm actually going to use a sketch what I already drew, not because I didn't like the drawing I just showed you, but because I didn't want to repeat the next step, which is transferring the sketch onto a separate paper. What I did, I placed a thin, fairly see-through paper over my sketch and I traced over it. You only need to do this if you do not want to tear up the pages in your sketchbook. Otherwise, if you are using, for example, a printer paper, you can follow the next step, and that is transfer your sketch onto the watercolor cardstock. I scribbled the lead of the pencil all over the back of the sketch, then I placed it on top of the watercolor cardstock. I also used a washi on the top to keep it in place. And then, using my pencil, I traced over the lines, and because I scribbled the lead of the pencil on the back, this transferred the sketch onto the watercolor cardstock. There are actually products that are specifically for transferring sketches, but this is a much cheaper way to do this. As I was removing the sketch, I noticed that one line was still missing, and because I used the washi, I was able to place it back and drew the additional line. As you can see here, I'm using a taller paper. It's about 21 centimeters long, and my sketch was on an A6 paper, so I had to extend the wavy line, and I also added a bow. The size of the paper is completely up to you. You can use the traditional A6, or if you're in the US, A2, and if you are painting a picture, you can go bigger. Next, I applied the masking fluid over the kite and the bows. If you don't have a masking fluid, just be careful when painting the sky around the kite. I used a damp brush and I applied a thin layer of the fluid, and then I let it dry for a few minutes. I picked a spare brush that I don't really use, but not to damage your brush when using a masking fluid, apply a small amount of dish soap with a water onto the brush. This prevents the masking fluid from gumming up your brush. Finally, let's start painting. I'm going to do the wet on wet technique. First, I applied clean water over the whole panel. You want to see a slight sheen on the paper, but you don't want the water to be pooling. And then I used a blue paint and I painted over the whole background. I applied just one layer of the same shade, but I didn't paint from edge to edge. I left about half a centimeter on each side without any paint. This is actually why I'm doing the wet on wet technique, as the edges are going to be much softer. After I applied the blue over the background, I thought the color was a little bit too light, so I added slightly more saturated paint to the background and painted again. And then I wanted to create clouds doing the technique where you soak up the paint using paper towel. I cut my paper towel in half as I didn't want to get overly big clouds. And while the background was still wet, I formed a small oval shape from the paper towel. I squished the paper towel together and pressed it onto the paper. this soaks up the paint and creates clouds. I place the clouds along the edges, repeating the same technique with the paper towel. Here it is important that you use paints that can be lifted. What you can do before you start painting, you can do a swatch and try if you can lift the paint with the paper towel. If it works, you're good to go. I think I should have painted the sky a little bit darker, but then I didn't want it to be too dark because the kite is the star here. But I used my brush and added some saturated paint around the clouds to darken it up. This is actually the first time I'm doing this technique, not sure if I like it. The clouds here do look a little bit weird, but after I paint the kite, it will look much better. To paint the kite, first I remove the masking fluid. If you have something like adhesive eraser, you can use that, but I just use my finger to remove it. I picked pink and orange paints, and I also will be adding yellow. You can use whatever colors you like. You don't have to use 3 colors, you can just use 2 or even 1. I first wet the whole surface of the kite using a clean water, and then I used yellow in the middle and orange and pink on the sides. Once it was dry, I added second layer, but otherwise I didn't do anything special. For the bows, I used the same pink, orange and yellow, but I also added blue and purple. The last thing I needed to paint are the lines. I picked a brown paint and I'm also using a long bristle brush. This brush is absolutely awesome, it helps me to paint long lines. This one is in the size 2. I wish I had size 1 or even 0 because I feel the lines are still quite thick, but it's still better than struggling with the tip of the round brush because my hands shake a lot. If you don't have such brush, just use the tip of the round brush. Or just use a black fine liner, I think that would look great as well. The cardstock warped a bit, so I placed it into a book to flatten it, and the next day I assembled the card. Before I adhered it onto the card base, I had to trim the top and the bottom a bit. The sides were already 5 mm shorter, so I used my paper trimmer for that. I just like to have the panel smaller than the card base because this creates a nice frame. Next I adhered the panel onto the card base using a liquid glue. I placed an acrylic block over it as well as a jar with water. This is what I had at hand, so it adheres properly. Also, the longer card bases I bought already pre-made, I didn't make them myself. And that's it, the card is finished. I think it looks really cute. This would be actually my type of a masculine card as well as a kid's card. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I would really appreciate if you gave this video a like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And I will see you in my next video very soon.